the late 1950s, there were places on Earth that did not officially exist. They had no names on maps, no addresses, and no public records. Trains passed them without stopping. Roads curved away from them. Letters sent there vanished. If you asked about them, people changed the subject. If you pressed, they denied everything. One of those places sat deep in the southern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. It was called Chelyabinsk 40. At least, that was the name printed on internal documents. To the outside world, it did not exist at all. Chelyabinsk 40 was a closed city, built in total secrecy after World War II. Its true purpose was never announced, but everyone inside knew why it had been created. This was one of the Soviet Union's most important industrial sites, part of a race that was never acknowledged publicly, but was understood by those at the highest levels of power. The Cold War had begun, and secrecy mattered more than safety. A city built on silence at Chelyabinsk 40 was not marked by fences or warning signs that civilians could see. Its isolation was enforced through bureaucracy, fear, and obedience. Entry required permission. Leaving required justification. Speaking about the city outside its boundaries was forbidden. Residents lived in clean apartment blocks, shopped at stock stores, and received better wages than most Soviet citizens. In return, they accepted absolute silence. They worked at a nearby industrial complex known as Mayak. Mayak's function was simple in theory and dangerous in practice. It processed highly sensitive materials for the state. The work was rushed, the expectations relentless, and the margins for error dangerously thin. Safety protocols existed on paper. In reality, speed was prioritized above all else. Mistakes were not tolerated, reporting problems was discouraged, and failures, when they happened, were buried, literally and figuratively. The culture of suppression inside Mayak, conditions were tense, equipment ran hot, processes were experimental. Engineers were often working with systems that had never been tested at full scale. When something went wrong, it was easier to adjust the numbers on a report than to slow production. Waste materials were disposed of in nearby waterways. Protective standards changed constantly. Workers were rarely told the full extent of what they were handling. Over time, small irregularities became normal. A reading slightly off. Ignore it. A system running warmer than expected. Adjust later. A safety valve behaving unpredictably. It will hold. Until one day, it didn't. September 29th, 1957. The day itself began quietly. There were no alarms heard in surrounding towns. No emergency broadcasts. No public warnings. The Soviet Union went about its business as usual. Inside the Mayak facility, however, something had already gone catastrophically wrong. One of the underground storage systems used to contain industrial byproducts had been losing its cooling capability. This wasn't sudden. The failure had been developing slowly, unnoticed or ignored due to faulty monitoring equipment and inadequate maintenance. As the temperature inside the storage unit increased, pressure built. There were no redundant systems to stop what came next. At approximately 4:22 p.m., the containment failed. What followed was not officially acknowledged as an incident, let alone a disaster. But the force released was powerful enough to damage nearby structures, send debris into the air, and release an invisible threat across a vast region. People nearby felt a shockwave. Windows shattered. A column of dust rose into the sky. Then, silence. No sirens, no announcements, no evacuation orders. Life outside the facility continued as if nothing had happened. The invisible fallout, within hours, fine particles began drifting across the countryside. They settled on forests, fields, rivers, and villages. Livestock grazed beneath it. Children played outside. Farmers worked the land. No one was told to stay indoors. No one was warned. The material could not be seen, smelled, or felt. Days passed, then weeks, then months. People began noticing changes, but not ones they could immediately explain. Crops failed in strange patterns. Animals grew ill. Workers inside Mayak were reassigned quietly. Entire villages were visited by officials who asked questions, took measurements, and left without explanation. Eventually, evacuation orders came, but only to select areas and without reason. Residents were told their homes were unfit for living. Some were relocated permanently. Others were allowed to return after superficial cleanups. Personal belongings were destroyed without explanation. Graves were moved. Records disappeared. And the official story remained unchanged. Nothing had happened. A disaster. Without a name, for decades, the Soviet government refused to acknowledge any major event in the region. Western scientists noticed strange patterns years later. Unusual readings, environmental anomalies, and health statistics that did not make sense. When questioned, Soviet officials dismissed the findings as propaganda or error. The term Kyshtym Disaster itself was not used inside the Soviet Union. The nearby town of Kyshtym was not even the true location of the event. It was simply the closest identifiable place that existed on maps. The disaster had no official name because officially it had never occurred, and that may be the most disturbing part of all. The horror of erasure. What makes the Kyshtym disaster so unsettling is not just what happened, but how it was handled. No immediate warning, no public acknowledgement, no transparent investigation. Instead, there was denial, relocation, and silence. People were exposed without their knowledge. Communities were dismantled quietly. Scientists were forbidden from publishing their findings. Even mentioning the incident could lead to severe consequences. History itself was edited. For nearly 30 years, the world remained unaware of what had unfolded in the Ural Mountains that afternoon in 1957. And by the time the truth began to surface, much of the damage had already been done. After September 29, 1957, the Soviet Union faced a problem it could not admit existed. The explosion at the Mayak facility had released something that could not be contained by walls, guards, or secrecy. It moved silently across the landscape, settling far beyond the borders of Chelyabinsk 40. Yet the state's response followed a familiar pattern. Control the narrative by refusing to create one. No public statement was issued. No emergency declaration followed. Instead, a quiet mobilization began, one that unfolded in fragments spread across months and disguised as routine administrative activity. To the outside world, nothing had changed. To the people living in the affected region, everything did. Officials, without explanations, within days, government teams began appearing in nearby villages. They arrived without insignia, carrying measuring devices and clipboards. They asked residents to step aside while they inspected homes, wells, livestock, and fields. Questions were met with rehearsed answers. This is a standard inspection. Temporary relocation. Routine environmental adjustment. No one used the word danger. No one explained what was being measured. No one was told what they might be carrying on their clothes or skin. Some villages were evacuated quickly. Others were left untouched for weeks. The logic behind these decisions was never shared with residents and often seemed inconsistent. Two settlements only a few kilometers apart might receive entirely different treatment. People noticed, but questioning officials was not an option. The vanishing villages. In certain areas, entire communities were erased. Residents were instructed to pack only essential belongings. Homes were demolished or buried. Wells were filled in. Crops were destroyed. Roads were rerouted. Over time, even the names of these villages disappeared from maps. In some cases, people were relocated to new settlements with little explanation. They were told not to speak about their former homes. Any attempt to return was blocked. The land itself was declared off limits, but without signage that explained why. Years later, travelers passing through the southern Urals would notice stretches of forest where no one lived, fields that were never farmed, and abandoned foundations overtaken by vegetation. There were no memorials, no markers, no official record of why these places no longer existed. The silent workforce, perhaps the most troubling aspect of the response, involved those tasked with cleaning up the aftermath. Large groups of workers, many of them young, inexperienced or conscripted, were sent into affected zones. They were given minimal protective equipment and little information. Their instructions were simple: remove contaminated materials, clear debris, and restore the appearance of normality. Some shoveled soil, some dismantled buildings, some worked directly around damaged infrastructure. They were told this work was safe. They were told it was necessary. They were told nothing else. Decades later, records of these cleanup teams would prove difficult to find. Many documents were classified. Others were destroyed. Names disappeared from rosters. Medical histories were incomplete or sealed. The people who carried out this work were rarely acknowledged, either at the time or afterward. Science under lock and key. Inside the Soviet scientific community, something unprecedented was happening. Researchers began collecting data that contradicted official claims. Environmental readings were unusual. Long-term patterns suggested that something significant had occurred. But discussing these findings publicly was forbidden. Publishing was blocked. Conferences were monitored. Research was labeled state-sensitive. Scientists who pushed too hard faced professional consequences. Careers stalled. Funding disappeared. In some cases, individuals were reassigned to unrelated work. The truth was not denied outright. It was simply never allowed to form. A name that couldn't be spoken. The phrase Kyshtym Disaster did not emerge organically within the Soviet Union. It came from outside. Western researchers, noticing unexplained anomalies in environmental data years later, began asking questions. When Soviet officials refused to provide answers, foreign scientists pieced together what they could using satellite imagery, leaked reports, and survivor accounts. Because Chelyabinsk 40 was not publicly acknowledged, the nearest visible town, Kyshtym, became the reference point. Even then, Soviet authorities continued to deny any major event. The disaster existed only in whispers. Living with the unknown, for residents who remained in the region, daily life continued, but under a shadow they did not fully understand. Some noticed unusual restrictions placed on land use. Fishing was prohibited in certain areas. Farming was discouraged in others. Officials offered vague explanations about soil quality or industrial runoff. People adapted because adapting was the only option. Children grew up unaware of what had happened before they were born. Parents avoided discussing the past. Questions went unanswered. The silence became inherited. Why secrecy mattered more than truth, from the perspective of the Soviet state, acknowledging the disaster posed risks that extended beyond public safety. Admitting the event would have meant admitting failure, technical, administrative, and political. It would have exposed weaknesses in systems that were supposed to demonstrate strength. It would have provided ammunition to foreign critics during the height of Cold War tension. So the truth was delayed, and delay became denial. A disaster that continued after it ended. Unlike sudden catastrophes that arrive and pass, the Kyshtym disaster unfolded slowly. Its effects did not announce themselves all at once. They appeared over time, dispersed across geography and generations. Because of this, it was easier to ignore, easier to fragment, and easier to deny. There was no single moment the story ended, and in many ways, it never did. For nearly 2 decades after the event in the southern Urals, the Kyshtym disaster existed in a strange state of non-existence. Inside the Soviet Union, it was never mentioned publicly. Outside of it, no one knew enough to name it. The land remained altered. The people affected carried their experiences quietly, and the institutions responsible continued operating as if nothing had gone wrong. But silence has limits, and in the 1970s, cracks began to form. The first suspicious patterns. Western scientists studying environmental data began noticing irregularities that didn't align with known explanations. Certain regions showed abnormal long-term contamination patterns that could not be traced to recognized events. The data didn't point to a single, sudden occurrence, like an atmospheric test. Instead, it suggested a localized industrial release, one that had happened years earlier and had never been acknowledged. When researchers asked Soviet counterparts for clarification, they received vague responses or none at all. The official position remained unchanged. There had been no major industrial disaster in the region, but the numbers refused to cooperate. A man who refused to stay silent. The first detailed account of what may have happened did not come from a government report or official investigation. It came from a scientist. In the mid-1970s, Boris Medvedev, a Soviet biologist living abroad, published a paper describing a large-scale environmental incident in the southern Urals. His account was careful, technical, and based on years of indirect observation and scattered testimony. He did not claim certainty, but he laid out evidence that something significant had occurred. The reaction was immediate. Soviet authorities dismissed the work as misinformation. They accused Medvedev of exaggeration and political motivation. Western observers, meanwhile, were divided. Some considered the claims plausible, others too speculative. Yet for the first time, the disaster had a voice. The gradual confirmation over time. Medvedev's account began to align with other independent findings. Satellite imagery revealed unusual patterns in the landscape, abandoned zones, altered vegetation, and areas restricted without explanation. Travelers' accounts described regions locals avoided, not because they were told to, but because everyone knew better than to ask why. Small pieces of testimony emerged from former residents and workers who had left the Soviet Union. Their stories were fragmented, cautious, and often incomplete. But they shared consistent themes. Sudden relocations, unexplained inspections, instructions not to speak about certain places. None of them used the word disaster. They didn't have to. The government's calculated shift. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was changing. Policies like glasnost allowed limited openness, and with that openness came pressure to address long-denied events. In 1989, more than 30 years after the explosion, Soviet authorities finally acknowledged that an industrial accident had occurred at the Mayak facility. The admission was carefully framed. Details were minimal. Responsibility was vague. Long-term consequences were downplayed. The narrative emphasized that the situation was under control and that corrective measures had been taken long ago. There was no apology. There were no names. and many questions remained unanswered. Why the delay mattered. 3 decades of silence had consequences. By the time acknowledgement came, records were incomplete. Entire populations had been relocated without documentation. Medical data was scattered, classified, or lost. Environmental changes had become normalized. There was no clear baseline to measure impact against. The delay didn't just obscure the past, it made accountability nearly impossible. A disaster rewritten. Once officially recognized, the Kyshtym disaster was reintroduced to the world as a technical failure rather than a human one. Language mattered. The focus shifted to equipment malfunction, design limitations, and procedural errors. Less attention was given to the culture that allowed warnings to be ignored, or the systems that punished transparency. The disaster became a footnote in industrial history rather than a case study in secrecy, and for many, that framing felt intentional. What could have been learned had the event been acknowledged immediately? It might have reshaped global standards for industrial safety and transparency. Instead, the lessons were delayed, and in some cases, never learned. Other nations continued to prioritize output over caution. Other facilities repeated similar mistakes. And other communities would later find themselves exposed without explanation. History didn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymed. Memory without closure. Even today, the Kyshtym disaster occupies an uneasy place in historical memory. It is recognized, but not fully examined, documented, but not fully understood, discussed, but rarely felt. Unlike events marked by dramatic images or immediate global reaction, this disaster left no defining photograph, no moment that could be replayed on screen. Its impact was slow, quiet, and easy to forget, which may be the most unsettling part of all. Long after the explosion at the Mayak facility faded from memory, the land remembered, not in ways that were immediately obvious, and not in ways that could be easily explained to those who didn't already know where to look, but in subtle, persistent changes that refused to disappear. The southern Ural region did not return to normal. It learned to exist differently. A zone without a border. Unlike disasters that leave behind clear exclusion zones, the aftermath of Kyshtym created something more unsettling. An affected region with no visible edges. There were no fences stretching across the countryside, no universally enforced boundary lines, no warning signs announcing danger to travelers. Instead, access restrictions appeared selectively. Some roads were blocked, some forests were off limits, some lakes were suddenly declared unsuitable for fishing. To outsiders, these limitations appeared arbitrary. To locals, they were quietly understood. There were places you didn't go, not because you were told why, but because everyone knew not to ask. The East Ural trace over time. Scientists would identify a long, narrow area extending northeast from the Mayak facility, where the environmental impact was most concentrated. This region became known as the East Ural trace. From above, it looked like a faint scar across the landscape. On the ground, it was harder to define. Vegetation patterns changed. Certain plant species became dominant while others faded. Wildlife behavior shifted in ways that didn't align with seasonal cycles. Soil composition varied unexpectedly from one area to the next. To an untrained eye, it looked like ordinary wilderness, but it wasn't untouched. It was adapted. Communities that adjusted quietly, people who lived near the affected areas learned to modify their behavior without being fully informed. Certain crops were no longer planted. Certain water sources were avoided. Certain traditions, fishing, foraging, seasonal gatherings, slowly faded away. These changes were never announced publicly. They emerged gradually, passed down through habit rather than explanation. Parents told children where not to play. Elders warned newcomers about bad land. Stories replaced facts. Over time, the reasons behind these adjustments became less important than the rules themselves. The cost of not knowing. One of the most profound consequences of the Kyshtym disaster was not physical, it was psychological. People were asked to trust authorities who refused to explain their actions. They were expected to comply with restrictions without understanding their purpose. They were relocated, resettled, and monitored without consent. This created a lasting sense of uncertainty. Was the land safe? Had it ever been? Would it be again? Without answers, anxiety became normalized. Silence filled the gaps. Scientific observation limited access. In later decades, controlled studies were permitted in parts of the affected region, but only under strict supervision. Access remained limited. Data collection was selective. Some findings were published. Others remained classified. What did emerge confirmed what locals had suspected for years. The environment had been altered in ways that could not be easily reversed. Time alone was not enough. Nature could adapt, but not erase. A landscape that became a warning. Ironically, the region surrounding the disaster site eventually became one of the most closely monitored environments in the world. What had once been hidden became studied. Researchers observed how ecosystems responded to prolonged exposure, how species adapted or failed to, how recovery differed depending on soil type, climate, and human intervention. The land became a living record, a reminder of what happens when control replaces caution, why some places are still restricted. Even today, certain areas near the former Maya complex remain inaccessible to the public. The official reasons vary: environmental protection, industrial activity, national security. But the underlying truth is simpler. Some consequences don't have an expiration date, and some mistakes cannot be fully undone. Memory without monuments. Despite its scale, the Kyshtym disaster has no grand memorial. There are no large museums dedicated solely to it, no widely recognized anniversary, no global moment of remembrance. Its legacy exists quietly, in altered landscapes, fragmented records, and inherited habits. The absence of spectacle made it easier to forget, but forgetting does not equal resolution. By the time the Soviet Union finally acknowledged that something had gone wrong in the southern Urals, the world had already moved on. New crises had captured attention. New technologies had reshaped global priorities. The Cold War itself was entering a different phase. And yet, buried beneath decades of silence, the Kyshtym disaster waited, unfinished, unresolved, and largely unknown. Its late arrival into public awareness shaped everything that followed. Because when a truth is delayed long enough, it doesn't arrive as a shock. It arrives as an inconvenience. Why Kyshtym never became a household name. Some disasters become symbols. Others fade into footnotes. Kyshtym fell into the second category, not because it was small, but because it lacked visibility. There was no dramatic broadcast, no iconic image, no defining moment caught on camera. What happened unfolded behind closed doors, deep within restricted territory, under a system designed to suppress exposure rather than manage it. The absence of spectacle worked against it. History remembers what it can see. Comparison. Without context. When the disaster was finally discussed internationally, it was often compared to other industrial accidents. But the comparisons were imperfect. Those events were documented in real time. Their consequences were measured publicly. Their lessons, however painful, were debated openly. Kyshtym had none of that. Its timeline was fragmented, its data incomplete, its witnesses scattered or silent. Even its official acknowledgement was carefully worded, minimizing both scale and responsibility. The result was a disaster that felt abstract, real but distant. The human cost that couldn't be calculated. One of the most enduring questions surrounding Kyshtym is also the hardest to answer. How many people were affected? The honest answer is that no one knows, not fully. Records were sealed, medical data was classified, population movements were poorly documented. Some communities vanished without leaving paper trails. Without transparency, statistics lose meaning. What remains instead are patterns, altered demographics, unexplained health trends, and generational stories that don't align with official timelines. Numbers could have clarified responsibility. Silence erased it. A disaster that shaped policy. Quietly, although rarely acknowledged, Kyshtym influenced international thinking in subtle ways. As fragments of information emerged, they reinforced concerns about secrecy in high-risk industries. They fueled debates about oversight, redundancy, and the danger of prioritizing output over safety. But because the disaster wasn't fully exposed, its lessons were absorbed indirectly, through caution rather than confrontation. This muted impact may be its most troubling legacy. Lessons learned quietly can also be forgotten quietly. Why the truth wasn't enough. When the Soviet Union admitted to the event in 1989, it did not trigger widespread outrage or global reckoning. Why? Because too much time had passed. The people responsible were gone or unreachable. The systems that enabled the failure had evolved. The urgency had dissipated. The truth arrived, but without momentum. It was acknowledged, then archived. The psychological aftermath. For those who lived through it or inherited its consequences, the disaster never truly ended. Living near an altered landscape creates a specific kind of awareness. It changes how people relate to their environment. Trust in institutions erodes quietly. Questions linger without answers. This uncertainty becomes normalized. And normalization is powerful. It allows extraordinary circumstances to fade into routine. A mirror held to authority. At its core, the Kyshtym disaster is not just a story about technology. It is a story about control. About what happens when systems prioritize secrecy over safety. When warnings are ignored because acknowledging them would be inconvenient. When the absence of information becomes a tool rather than a failure. The explosion was sudden. The denial was deliberate. Why this story still matters. Kyshtym remains relevant, not because it was unique, but because it wasn't. It represents a category of disasters that rarely make headlines. Those hidden long enough to lose their power to demand change. Events like this challenge the assumption that transparency follows catastrophe. Sometimes, catastrophe follows silence. The danger of forgetting. For every well-documented disaster remembered by name, there are others that linger in obscurity. They don't disappear because they were small. They disappear because forgetting was easier than facing them. Kyshtym reminds us that history is not only shaped by what is revealed, but by what is delayed. And delay can be just as destructive. The final question. The most unsettling aspect of the Kyshtym disaster may not be what happened in 1957. It may be what it reveals about the systems we still rely on today. How many risks remain hidden because acknowledging them would be inconvenient? How many warnings go unheeded because they challenge authority? How many consequences are postponed until accountability becomes impossible? Kyshtym does not offer closure. It offers a warning. This was a disaster without witnesses, without footage, without headlines. A disaster that survived by being forgotten. And perhaps that is the most frightening outcome of all.